we thought it was appropriate to have Sister Deborah Hurd introduce her partner from Tennessee State, Dr. Greg Carr.
I have the great pleasure of having been tricked into this introduction by Dr. Morrell. But it brings me great honor to do this introduction. Greg Carr is the first Vice President of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, an Associate Professor of Africana Studies, and Chair of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, Adjunct Faculty at the Howard School of Law. He holds a PhD in African American Studies from Temple University and a JD from the Ohio State University College of Law. He's the co-editor of ASCAC's multi-volume African Oral History Project and was the School District of Philadelphia's first resident scholar on race and culture. Dr. Carr led a team of academics and educators in the design of the curriculum framework for Philadelphia's mandatory high school African American History course. These materials are the first to approach African American history using Africana Studies methodology. He is a co-founder of the Philadelphia Freedom Schools Movement, a community-based academic initiative that has involved over 13,000 elementary, high school, and college students. Dr. Carr has presented his curriculum work for the Board of Public Education in Salvador Bahia and has lectured across the U.S. and in Ghana, Egypt, South Africa, Brazil, France, and England, among other places. His publications have appeared in, among other places, the African American Studies Reader, Socialism and Democracy, Africana Studies, Publications of the Modern Language Association of America, the National Urban League's 2012 State of Black America, and Malcolm X, a Historical Reader. Dr. Carr is a former member of the board of the National Council of Black Studies. He's a grantee of Howard's Fund for Academic Excellence, invited lecturer on pedagogy from Howard Center for Excellence in Teaching, and has been named Professor of the Year 3 times by Howard University. As one of the faculty participants in the College of Arts and Sciences Summer Study Abroad Initiative, he has led or co-led student study courses in South Africa and/or Egypt 6 times. Dr. Carr is a member of the Freshman Seminar Leadership Team and served as coordinator of the Mellon Interdisciplinary Research Course Initiative. He has represented Howard University as a spokesman in a wide range of print and electronic media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Le Monde, USA Today, MSNBC, National Public Radio, Tabby Smiley Show, The Diane Reeves Show, Diverse Magazine, and CNN, as well as a range of local radio, television, and internet media outlets. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Carr 31 years ago as freshman at Tennessee State University in Nashville. And it has been a pleasure to observe him over these past 31 years grow into this amazing, amazing scholar that he is today. So it is with great honor and pride that I introduce Dr. Greg Carr. Would you all please welcome him?
There's absolutely nothing I can say tonight about Anderson Thompson, other than my personal experience with your brother, that you all already know and know more than I do. So, for those of you who know him well, including
Use the mic.
you got a lot.
Hey, Greg, is it on? Or you wait to turn it on?
We make sure light work.
It is? Use that.
Off. So I can just turn this one off?
Yeah.
Okay, that's just fine.
Okay.
Got it. So for those of you who know him well, particularly the elders Scott would put the paperwork together, and that would be Harold Pace. If I might have your permission to continue.
By all means.
Thank you. Comrade, thank you, brother, for letting me come out here. And you good? Okay. Yeah, let me take it. Yeah, because we turn it back on? Yeah. Okay, so
You're back on, so you don't need that.
okay. Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay. Thank you. I'm glad to have a good friend run that microphone up, and I'm relieved to be here tonight instead of in Washington, because they already called me from Howard and said that when these white boys come back in Ferguson, Missouri, and let this white policeman go, they want to know where I am. And I said, I don't think you want me on television tonight. So I'm in Chicago with the blackest people in the universe. Brother Mike Brown is on his ancestral journey, and the people in this room are very clear that we ain't never been Americans, so we are not surprised, and nor are we particularly animated by the idea that they're going to do what we knew they were going to do. Let's not get distracted. That would pretty much be what I would say, and they probably would like that too. So I want to thank Conrad for getting me out of the city, and for me being able to be here, and to my sister Deborah Hurd, who I have known since before we were in class. We were in the band together, Tennessee State. Aristocrat of bands. And Deb was one of the first people I met on campus. We were in August at that hot heat, stomping around in the dirt out there on that practice field, I guess is what they call it. Every time we would stop, the cloud of dust would just rise up and wait and see everybody and make sure we got our lines on. Ooh, man, we just made 18 years old. It's hard to believe it's been that long. But not only is she my very good friend, we all are very fortunate to have her here because she is a student of Dr. Thompson's. And you know how important Kush, how important Nubia, how important the Sudan is to the work of Anderson Thompson and Deborah Hurd, who's following in the line and extending the tradition laid down not only by Dr. Thompson but by Brother Ben Levy and those who have worked very long in that area of classical Africa. She is one of the most highly accomplished scholars of ancient Nubia that we have. So I'm glad that you all have her here. She is absolutely emptying the University of Chicago of anything they have or work. And that too, continuing the tradition of many people in this room. So, including this brother. Thank you for the libation, Yvonne. That was beautiful to bring the ancestors in the way that you did. When I put this picture up, Yvonne said, oh, that's a Negro picture at that time. I suppose he is in disguise there a little bit, but he got Africa on his lapel pin. And this time last week, we were in Norfolk, Virginia, which is, of course, very close to the place where the British hijacked 2 Portuguese schooners, brought the first Africans that they had under their thumb to mainland British North America, Jamestown. And we were there for the Mid-Atlantic region of ASCAP, Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, for Anne Folks might not know what that is. And gave a talk on Dr. Clark, John Clark. And the 3 terms that I tried to use to think about them a little bit was time, networks, and narrations. And I've been working on the talk about Dr. Thompson. So I said, well, maybe I would take what I was going to say about Dr. Thompson and shape it to that larger arc. Because quite frankly, Anderson Thompson, it's hard, you can't really overstate his importance as we know. And people say, if it weren't for this person, I wouldn't be here. But literally, if it weren't for Anderson Thompson, I wouldn't be standing here. Because it was Dr. Thompson who first, out of the folks in ASCAP, beyond Columbus, Ohio, where we were in school at the time. Oh, and that reminds me, I never practiced law. I got my degree and I decided I want to go to grad school. So let me teach a class in law school and I had the best time of my life. But if some of y'all get in trouble, I'm going to put her on blast because she did practice for a while. That's my friend Deborah Hurd. We left Tennessee State. I went to Ohio State. She went to Tulane and she got a JD too. Real quiet. You would never know what to look at. But trust me, y'all got one of the best over here. But yeah, absolutely. Please. Columbus, Ohio. It was Dr. Thompson who came for a Midwestern Region Conference for ASCAC in 1991. Before then, we had just read him. And the first time I got a chance to talk to Anderson Thompson at any great length, we talked for a long time, one Friday night at Columbus Alternative High School in Columbus, Ohio, because he walked in the room, as he always does, baseball cap, full low, sweatshirt, jeans, very nondescript, and kind of ninja move, very silent. You never know who the real guy is. But he had in his hand a hardback copy with the dust check and a chance to weigh into the rebirth of African civilization. And I'm like, dude, where did you get that? And we haven't stopped talking since. This is a man whose whole life is consumed with study and teaching. So we're going to talk a little bit about it tonight. And then we'll do a Dobala. I was like one of the scenes from a black exploitation film in the 1970s. They get ready to plot something right here. What are they talking about? Noel here, that picture. We'll say Dobala and talk about the Aztec genealogy in particular. This genealogy are the keepers of Medu-Neter, divine speech. Dr. Carruthers, of course, Baba Jetty is a keeper of divine speech now. Dr. Thompson is the keeper of Medu-Neter, good speech. He's still here speaking. So as Dr. Carruthers would often say in the evening, tonight we'll convene a study group of the whole in another moment of crisis and opportunity. As I said, we're here. Folks are going down to Missouri. Hard to believe Dre and Harriet Scott are buried not 10 minutes away from everywhere. Everybody's gathered on Florissant in Missouri. And this country will never learn until it ain't the United States of America that until they deal with this situation, it's not going to go away, it's only going to get worse. That's right. Some of that black power that you all put into the veins of Barack Obama, apparently he had a remissive relapse yesterday, and some of it bubbled to the top, and he actually got some nerve around this time yesterday and told our brothers and sisters who speak Spanish that they can stay in the country that they were in before the white people tried to take it from them. So it's very good to see that some of that is back in. But we're in a moment of crisis and opportunity in this country.
That's right.
And it's a good moment. Everybody should feel very good about this because this country is getting ready to come apart. And it's a good thing because we'll never and you can't destroy something that was never quite built right in the first place. It was going to fall. This is a moment of crisis, but it's a moment of opportunity. So tonight, we want to highlight and listen to the work of Anderson Thompson very quickly. As Dr. Royal says, Brother Conrad said, you can't. The man has too many dimensions. So we're just going to use a few key words to think about him. Time, network, and narration. Time, network, and narration. What is time? Well, there's time is constant. That's natural time. Time that exists beyond our experience. Time as experience. That's the time that we create by our relationships with each other. And of course, 30 years ago last year, Essays in Ancient Egyptian Studies by Jacob Carruthers really explored the dimensions of time and space and gave us some sense of how we need to be thinking about time and space. But it was Jacob Carruthers who said many times in this auditorium, all over this building, and his house throughout the country and around the world, he said it was Anderson Thompson that rescued him from being a Negro. As many of y'all heard him say it many times. It's always interesting to see, tell folks, you look at the moon, he said the moon is so bright, but the moon is reflecting the light of the sun. That's the Black Muhammad used to say right here in this city. But it's interesting when you think about Anderson Thompson because he isn't often seen. But when you see folks who have been influenced by him, you see his fingerprints all over them. And Dr. Carruthers' Essays in Ancient Egyptian Studies, which were worked out over a long period of time of conversation with many people in this room, including Anderson Thompson, has us think about time as experience. Network, what is network? Well, we'll think about network as connection. Connection to people, and as disruption. That's important. A network isn't just who you're connected to, it's also who you are disrupting. That's going to be very important to think about. For example, here's a picture from a couple of years ago when we had the association meeting at Howard University a couple of years ago. Some of y'all recognize Brother Ndishi there on the right, who's out on the East Coast out of New York. And on the left, this brother has on a Union Army uniform. Sits in the middle of the dress, as you can see somebody walking down the street here in Chicago or any place in the country.
That is a network that can't be explained because all three of those folks are African, and they're standing in front of a Jacob Lawrence picture. They're on the second floor of Howard University Student Center. But it's interesting because that disruption does not prevent the network from being strong. You can't tell an African by looking at it, as hard as we try sometimes. You can't tell who's not an African by looking at them either. We sometimes project what we want on people. Sometimes we can't tell who we're looking at. And sometimes we get caught up in looking at folks and we don't understand that if you can craft it the right way, you can send a communication and build a network through a feeling, but you have to master the narrative. But one thing I'll say very quickly, behind them, as I said, that's a long panel of Jacob Lawrence's work, the great Jacob Lawrence, who's certainly no stranger here in Chicago. That mural has no words, but often when young children, elementary school age children, come to Howard's campus and they're around, they do a little campus tour. I'm sure that other people do it, but I really think African people invented the college tour. Because, y'all will load up a bus full of 6th graders from Chicago and send them halfway across the country and all the way down the East Coast and through the South, back home on their spring break before anybody in. So you don't see white folks doing it. The value we have in education, I'm quite sure, like the family reunion and white service and some other things, we invented that. We have been a whole lot of stuff people mess up when they try to copy us. They just do exactly what we did. Don't try that. But when they bring the children, they'll ask me sometime, will you come talk to them? I say, yeah, sure. Tell them to meet me on the second floor of the student center. So there'll be a room full of children. And I say, now, how much y'all know about Black history? And somebody put their hands up, and they may say a few names. And that's okay. Well, listen, I think you know more than you think you know. Let's read this painting here. I want y'all to tell me the history of Black people by reading this painting. We'll start with the panel on the left and go all the way down. By the time we get down to the end of that wall, those children have recreated the history of African people in this country. Because Jacob Lawrence knew how to talk to Black people without words. You could use the images. And you could just see, when you have somebody 7, 8, 9 years old who can understand that, you understand that network cannot be erased by miseducation. It can be damaged, but can never be permanently erased. There's something deep in our spirit that allows us to think about that. So, finally, narration. How do we narrate? Well, narration can be inclusion. That's the narrative of the United States. They keep trying to include us. But there are also exclusions, and that's what Anderson Thompson is really talking about in his work. And in ASCAC, what we try to do in the association is not only deal with this question of African world history, but also try to understand what our experience is not. And that's really central to Dr. Thompson's work. Of course, there we have our JHC2 and Conrad work. John Henry Clark. Intellectual genealogies are practices of apprenticeship. They don't have to be. That's why I say as and not are. Because you can have a relationship with somebody you've never met in the physical form by reading them, hearing their voice. We have 1,000 freshman students at Howard reading W.E.B. Du Bois's The Education of Black People. We just finished our last class Tuesday night. And for the last class, we've been meeting since September, twice a week. I played one of the few recordings of Du Bois giving a lecture. He gave a talk at Johnson C. Smith in 1960, 2 months after the Student Outline Coordinating Committee was founded. And it was entitled Whither Now and Why. He was talking to social studies teachers in North Carolina. And he said, these laws are going to change, and segregation is going to go away, and then we're going to have the real issue, which is what are we going to be in this country? Are we going to disappear, or are we going to preserve African history and culture as a contribution to the modern world as it was the ancient and medieval world? He said, that's the question. The question is not equality with America. That's something that's going to come. The question is going to become, then what? That's the real question. So the question of intellectual genealogy, for that moment, those young people heard the voice of Du Bois. And after I pressed stop, and then we went back into the book, you could have heard a pin drop. It was like he was in the room. It's like, wow, this is a moment when you can hear this man's voice because we have a recording. But when you read this, something like that, but this intellectual genealogy as a practice of apprenticeship, that's different. What Baba Fukiao, Kipwardende Bumseki Fukiao, our recent ancestor, once called in one of the languages of Central Africa in the Kikongo spiritual traditions and language traditions, Lufuki, which he speculated may have been the root of the word funky. Lufuki means, you are in intimate relationship with somebody. And everybody in here has been in an intimate relationship with somebody where you literally got some of their essence on you and vice versa. That's Lufuki. After you leave that space, it could be a party or it could be more intimate than that. But when you leave that space, you know where you've been. And when you're ever in a space that triggers that memory, you're back there again. That's a different kind of apprenticeship. Those three brothers right there knew each other. They traveled, they debated, they argued, they built community, they gave each other shoulders. Sometimes they had each other's back. Shared spaces create Lufuki. And Lufuki is something that Ukiao says is transmitted between elders and apprentices, between masters and apprentices, not just the thing itself. So when we think about that, apprenticeships, they can be read as individual and collective acts, like a study group model, people are studying together. Speaking has been benevolent. People can aspire to good speech. And good speech, of course, as we know, the folks in this room, many of you all know it much better than I do, having studied the language much more intensely and over a much larger arc of time. The idea of speech isn't just what comes out of your mouth, it's indeed what the Yoruba people would say is the shaping of your iwa, your character. It is what you do. It's different, it's counterfactual from the idea of eloquence or entertainment. People speak very well. You don't remember anything they said. There'll be a lot of those eloquent Negroes thrown across television between now and next week trying to explain something with the Ferguson grand jury that can't be explained, but they'll sound good. One of them spent some time with my friend Michael Eric Dyson. Now I say it's my friend because he was sitting here, he just had to shake his head and laugh. Very eloquent, but what are you saying? Power of speech is the power of life. Anyone in here who has ever had their spirit elevated by a word from somebody or had your complete spirit taken down, not by a word from somebody, but just by them coming into space. My friend Georgia Dunstan, who worked on the Human Genome Project at Howard University, she is a geneticist by training. She talks about, she's into this quantum theory now. She's always hanging out with the physicists. She's saying, everything is energy. I know we have the physical body, but it's all vibrations. And that's why somebody can come in a room and bring everybody's spirit down. Somebody else can come in the room and bring everybody's spirit up. It's all vibrations. There's somebody who helped untangle the human genome. She said that's very important, but let's be very clear. This perception we have is very limited by our human experience. We are energy. And so the power of speech, the power of that vibration, the power of movement is literally the power of life. Modeling and developing techniques, interaction becomes social formation. When you're talking about apprenticeship, you're talking about somebody helping form somebody else. That's why people who hang out with other people a long time start acting like them. That's why people in this room can predict what other people they've known a long time will do and what they will say and how they will act because they spent a long time with them. As an apprentice, as a fellow traveler, look at Larry Carr. I wonder they make Larry put his hand on his chin like about a week ago, I guess, a week and a half ago, the History Makers, which is of course headquartered here in Chicago, they've given their corpus of recordings to the Library of Congress, so they're closer to where we are. I send my kids down there and go through the History Maker stuff. But this is the man that does most of the interviews. And he doesn't just ask people questions, he does deep background. And Larry, man, when Larry starts talking about how he asks people questions, how did you know that? Well, see, I know where that comes from, in part because I've watched him and Anderson Thompson just go back and forth for hours. And anytime I had students around, I would say, look, they go over there, let's go sit. And I want y'all to watch and see what this looks like. Nobody gonna pull out a book. Nobody's gonna pull out a pad of paper. And you're gonna wonder how they remember all that stuff. Thomas Hale many years ago wrote a book called Griots at War, where he said every couple of years in West Africa, they meet up to argue with each other because that's how you keep the memory going. Everybody sits and watches, and you tell the story, and after 6 hours, it's like, okay, now which one is accurate? We got a debate now. That's how you get prepared to do that. And as a consequence, much of the living memory of African people in this country over the last, even longer than half century, even closer to a century, is now been preserved. Particularly for those elders who are now ancestors, because I was talking to my students the other day, if you know somebody black over 80 years old in this country, you probably know somebody who knew somebody who was in slavery. That's how close it was. And after I told him I went to call my mama, because I said, I was 86 years old. I said, who was the oldest person you remember? And, of course you did. you know, that's very shocking for an 18 or 19-year-old to think about for the first time in her life or his life. But that's how close it is. And as master, of course, the masters, the ones who we know well, O'Delly Williams, Anderson Thompson, Sharshi McIntyre, Mark Heru, and of course, there's Dr. Carr with Mama Sybil, we saw this summer and sat and had a long conversation with her. And we build these apprenticeships through alliances with the like-minded, and also we contend. My very good friend and brother Bob Brown, you see Bob Brown come in the room, you better have all your T's crossed and I's dotted. And even if you do, we're going to triple check them for you. I watched Bob, man, it hasn't been a year ago. It was about 6-7 months ago. The new book on Sterling Carmichael, Kwame Ture, was written by Peniel Joseph, the guy who went to graduate school with, poor Peniel. Peniel showed up at Howard and said, I want to come to Howard's campus and do a book talk about the book. I said, okay. I told him yes because I knew if I said no, he would call somebody else and come. So of course, I told him yes, and then I called up all those snickheads and said, look, this is where he's going to be. He's going to talk, and we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to open it up. Bob came in and does what Bob did. Bob sitting in the front. Neil started shaking. Dude, you should have written the book if you want to write the book. Do you want to be an apprentice, or you want to be an entertainer? It's two different things. That's a tough crowd. Either you know what to do, or you don't. So the contention isn't always bad. The contention can bring out the sharpness. This is a picture that was taken at a wedding about a year ago. Francis Cress Welsing and Marimba Ani. We were out there at a wedding, and they sitting there. And I'm saying, boy, those sisters have beautiful smiles. You would never know that they cut you completely up. And never sweat or through that smile. But the idea is that you don't, just because we are serious about African people doesn't mean we don't have a joyful life. In fact, that's what gives us our joy. We try to keep people on the planet. So time, that's constant and experience. Time is constant. Natural time, you know, the white dudes like David Christian now writing books, maps of time. They're thinking about time beyond the human experience. They want to think now about that. Of course, you know, it's really about more or less trying to colonize, as Dr. Clark would say, colonize information. Clock time. Time is chronology. So French used to say, you know, Europeans come to Africa, the Africans looked at Europeans, looked at the clock and said, look at the white man's God. In other words, it's not about relationships, it's about that clock, as if we didn't invent time as well. Unwinding the clock, Vogel Johnson in her book talks about the idea that we have to have setup time. In other words, you create time for yourself by mastering a technique. You can't fake mastery. You have to spend a lot of time at first, but if you spend a lot of time at first, you can then make it look like you spend less and less time because you collapse that time based on your mastery. You can literally unwind the clock. Time is experience. There's relational time. We're all here having a relationship with each other. Event time. What time does it start? When everybody gets there. Time is genealogy. How do people relate to each other? Setup time, as I said, the time that you spend acquiring mastery. And thinking in time requires creating an intellectual rhythm, whether it be resetting the clock, and that's Dr. Thompson's challenge, creating historical philosophy and technique. Historiography, how do you create a rhythm where we can see each other over time? Whether it be like Petty Wimpy, creating the Calendar Project, working with folks here at the Comedic Institute, or the preliminary challenge, as Dr. Worrell has said, the first volume, the preliminary volume of the African World History Project. Network as connection and disruption. Well, as connection, we understand. People say, oh, everybody's an African. Yeah, if you go back far enough, but maybe we wandered in some places that we shouldn't have gone. But yes, we are connected technically. Now, that might be a born contention. Some people may think, no, we ain't connected. Okay, well, we can debate that and talk about that, and maybe we find out that that's not true. But as best as we can tell, the migrations connect us. Now, that doesn't mean everything's connected. Now, this, you know, I'm sure everybody here has seen something like this, right? You know, Atlas Peptus and, you know, Eflorus Unum, brother in the dollar bill tell us you this and that, boy, the Illuminati's doing the Bilderbergs and all this, but, oh, God, everything is not connected. Everything is not connected. And you can just keep saying that over and over again, but people are not going to believe you. Some people still going to believe that, you know, the Cubans killed Kennedy. Maybe they did, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But somebody going to believe that that dollar bill is really the key to human liberation because if you could just get up in the Illuminati, that you could go, now, man, because ultimately even that attempt at creating energy creates a disruption. And if you have one common goal, which is to survive and stand on our own. My buddy Gerald Horn, this is one of his latest books. Oh, yeah, Horn's the man. I saw Gerald about a month ago in Houston. I went down to give a talk at the University of Houston, and he surprised me. He said, Horn is in town, and we're going to go out to breakfast. So we sat there, man, and talked for a long time. I don't know how he does it. We'll talk more about him in a minute. But those of you who read this book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, this is a book that came out about a year ago. Horn's basic thesis is that, so many Negroes were doing what you see the brother right there on the cover of that book doing, that the British were really considering abolition. They had to, they were losing money. Certainly in the 13 colonies, it didn't make sense. And some colonies, the Caribbean was getting a little bit out of hand. And in Great Britain, you had some people who were pushing abolition. So when they did that, of course, the 13 British North American colonies said, well, hell no, we can't, no. And that's where the American Revolution came from. It wasn't a revolution, it was a counter-revolution. They had to get away because they had abolished slavery. And plus, they were telling the Negroes, if you fight with us, we'll set you free. That's what you call rebellion in research and disruption. What Stefano Harvey and Fred Moulton might call the undercurrent, something I talked about when I was here last year, back in last December, talking about the Center for Inner-City Studies. So narration as inclusion and exclusion. What does it mean to have destiny as memory? This is Jan Asman, the Egyptologist, who writes about 3 interrelated elements to memory. Reference to the past, which is mimetic memory. You learn through action. We all learn certain things that people showed us how to do. And we repeated it until we got good at it. The memory of things, objects of identity. So we know that there are certain things we associate with certain experiences that we've had. Communicative memory, systematic explanation and participation. In other words, we've had things explained to us systematically, and then we participate in building our knowledge. We communicate with each other. Kind of a Lufuki dimension. That's typically restricted to 80 to 100 years, meaning what? A human lifespan. A lot of stuff we learn, we take with us. We can't possibly communicate everything we learn. That's why as people get old, we get nervous. Because there's things we want to know. And you can't just open up somebody's head and download their mental computer into your mental computer. So then there's this game we play like, oh Lord, I hope you stay here another 100 years, but I know that's not realistic. We got to figure out how to convey this memory. But mortality intervenes, and it becomes a very, very, very kind of liminal space. The space gets difficult to manage. That's where community comes in. Cultural memory is the handing down of meaning. Now, how do you hand down meaning beyond the human lifespan? Well, Asman writes about identity. He's writing about Kemet in this book. Political or group-oriented imagination, really you have to build things like the memory of things. When you see a pyramid, the people who lived during that period knew what that was because that's a thing you built as a collective to preserve that memory. Future-informed inquiry. Here's Anderson Thompson, again, peeking through. We're going to deal with him a lot in a few minutes. Cultural continuity. By future-informed inquiry, I simply mean the idea that what we are doing is for the future. That's a very difficult concept a lot of times for us to think about. But when we think about it, it puts everything we're doing in context. Cultural continuity, the formation of tradition. Now we've got something we've done and we can literally pass it on, person to person. But how do you make it last? Long-term memory of societies, which means writing, can span up to 3,000 years. That's what Asman says. And I thought about it the first time I read this piece because I thought about it and I said, I wonder what the Chinese would say as they laughed. Because theirs is longer than that, which is why they don't get pressed about a whole lot. Last week we saw Obama and all the G20 folks were over there in China, and the first thing they did before they met, the Chinese made them switch out those clothes they brought and put on some Chinese clothes. We'll take this picture now, we go ahead and do some business. Let's be very clear, we have a long memory. We haven't been disrupted in the ways, and we're going to run all this. Now Dr. Thompson, if you read Dr. Thompson, you know that Dr. Thompson would categorize that worldview, that Asian worldview, as one of the worldviews that contests in this society. We'll talk more about that. He embodies these elements of good speech. How do we know? Well, time, he had the ability during the period when he shaped his question of historiography and continues in his continuing teaching of that philosophy to place the human experience, both the general human experience, all people, and the particular human experience, the African experience, in the context of worldview-centered time and space. The framing, shouldn't be too easy, the framing of history as the future. And he would say that over and over again in his writing and his talking and speeches. History is about the future. And people then go back into their research and try to figure out how to frame memory so that it helps them create vision. That's important in terms of time. Because what he's saying there, and we won't talk about it much tonight, but I want to mention it here since it's right here on the screen. When you look particularly at his dissertation, Dr. Thompson talks about the fact that we have to create a worldview that not only looks at the African human experience, but that looks at the world experience through lenses of African people. There's no subject we shouldn't comment on. And that often gets lost when we think about the study of African people. They think we want to study about black people. No, you have to have something to say about the Ukraine and nationalism in the Ukraine. You have to have something to say about the recent election in Brazil. Not just because those are Africans down there, although that's the primary interest, but because that's going to affect the geopolitics. You better figure out what they're doing in Australia with the G20 summit they just had. What is the African perspective on that? There's no subject we should not be in. In terms of network, Dr. Thompson has the ability to interact with and to channel disparate elements of community and connect through a pan-African ideological framework. So it doesn't matter we don't all agree. I'll sit in the meeting. It's very interesting. One of the things that we talked about, and there are people in this room, see, this is the thing. This is one of the things. Part of the reason that I love coming to Chicago, in addition to that y'all are family, is that there is no more important group of people who have been consistent in this country in terms of institution building and the influence.
That's right.
Really, it is really amazing. And so what I'm saying is that anything I say here that has anything to do with a person or a place or an event that took place in this city or places connected to this city, there's somebody in here who lived through that. I was going to mention, which is what made me think about it, I wanted to say that. Dr. Thompson was telling me one time about the topographical research. Look at y'all. See, now what about that? That's important. See, this is why it's gotta be written. Y'all gotta do that because we can't teach the curriculum if we don't have those documents. And I don't want the 80 to 100 year frame to have that disappear. But in that process, he was telling me about some of his adventures there. Dr. Page, I know you know about this too, and some of y'all class, so y'all know about that as well. That doesn't mean everybody had to agree. But it was very clear. We're gonna stay on this planet. There's some work we have to do. And so I think about that now because here we are in 2014, and you know, if some of these people who you see on television and see in the newspaper knew who the black people were, who they were talking to, who they thought they knew, they would faint dead away. You were involved with what? When? You know who? In other words, you just never know. But what we have to do is help our young people particularly understand that networks don't always have to tell people who they are. In fact, that's part of the way we are successful. Finally, narration. By applying and teaching a coherent philosophy of history, Dr. Thompson never loses sight, has never lost sight, never losing sight of the nexus of theory, action, and vision as part of the project of developing long-term social memory in service of African self-determination. In other words, theory and action are together. So time, network, and narrative as an individual purview. This is our friend Manu Amping wrote a book many years ago toward black community development. So he had to go into the screen lecture model, right? And he said, you know, and it's funny because first time I read Manu's book, and then that's before I met him, now and we become friends. We all have different learning styles, we have different learning styles. But I'm a fan of, if I don't never see another lecture, if I got a book, I'm good. And I'm thinking, the book is talking to me, I'm talking to the book. And I can sit and listen to a lecture forever, and I'm not going to subject y'all to that tonight. But the idea is that when we're dealing with information, this is a little difficult. Part of the process of teaching and learning involves memory and remembering, right? And what happens when the way that you remember it no longer exists? How do you fill that space? What is the probative function of gaps? Absences. The past. Everybody in here has lost somebody who's no longer here, but gained them as an ancestor. People have moved from different places. You know, people in Chicago, you know, you go back 100 years, most people in this room wouldn't be here. Those places we came from is the past, but that gap we fill often by romanticizing the past or reaching toward the past in ways that get fuzzier and fuzzier. What about the present? The living absences. We haven't talked to somebody for a while. or we haven't done something that we love to do for a while. And that absence then becomes something that we try to fill by memorializing. And so the thing we haven't done for a while becomes the thing that's, oh man, it's the best thing in the world. I can't wait till I do this again. Then you do it again and say, well, that wasn't as good as I mean, no, because the gap, you were trying to fill the gap. And now the future becomes the biggest gap of all. That's what our people are wandering around in this country, waiting on this grand jury as if there's something to wait on. What are you waiting on? I don't have a future in mind. I haven't thought about this. All I'm saying is, hands up, don't shoot. Okay, that's the Carr symbol. Well, I told my students that album. That's about the most powerful symbol you had, though. Right? You're like, yeah. I said, yes, I'm on. No, although hidden is the source of all light, power, and help. You understand it that way, then just sing your Richard Smallwood. I lift my hands in total prayer. Let my friend Jeremiah Wright would try to help them understand some kind of way. Why? Because right now, you got your hands on, can't tell me why. That man gonna shoot you up, down, sideways. Why you got your hands up? You better have a pistol.
Yes, right.
But you have no vision. And that's not your fault. That's because memory, there's a gap in the memory. There's no network that you can identify. So of course you have no vision. Thompson is saying history is about the future. That gap is going to be there until we fill it. And so now we live, however, in a society where the performer is often seen as a public election. The scholar's a data broker. You know, 33% of the people, okay, what are you talking about? Dr. Thompson writes in this dissertation, he says, you know, often what you see the probative value of European historiography is what they're trying to do when they raise what he calls the Negro question. Another one of those things y'all coined out here in Chicago when he wrote this down, the Negro question. What they're really saying is, how can Negroes help us continue our project of domination? That's the Negro question. So when they ask these Negroes on television or ask to interview them and say, tell me, Negro, what are you going to do to make sure that I don't have to have you on television anymore complaining about this stuff? Well, I think that if we get 3 more jobs and give me $15,000 more and another night in a hotel, I could possibly talk to 3 or 4 of these Negroes and maybe you can go home and say good night. Thank you very much, Negro, for your commentary. Now we're going to go to this other. I mean, this is your data. What are you doing? That has nothing to do with our liberation, and that's why people don't watch television anymore. There was a time when y'all had me Palmer. You understand? I mean, DC up there at Lee Green. You understand? I mean, they have Bob Law in New York. I mean, everybody has somebody who they kind of trusted. And when we think about today, who do we trust?
No one.
It's very difficult because there are people who are trying to break through. You know, the voice of the Negro is still swinging. They swing with both fists. I was on there July 4th talking about Independence Day and why we should be talking about Independence Day. So I said, okay, that's all right. Action is separated from study, creating an absence of deliberate, rigorous thinking in the context of time, narrative, and narration. So let's do with Anson Thompson. What's that, Thompson? Oh, we're the wrong way. Here we go. Thompson's trail, thinking through the history of the world on little slips of paper. Right? Anson Thompson is written the history of the world on little slips of paper. I took that person. That's what or try to. That's why you can't never lose the little slips of paper. We'll talk about archive in a minute. Classrooms, 50 years of teaching and organizing. Countless, you can't count. The formal classrooms, the informal classrooms, Conrad said, in this room, all up and down in this building, the inscriptions, whether it be Black Books Bulletin, Developing African Historiography, that Conrad showed you the book, The Memory of Things. Treatise on African Historiography, that's his dissertation, 1977, the African Principles series, the pamphlet series put out, Developing African Historiography, that's the one that's in the African World History Project. An unsigned collective authored text, Dr. Pates was reminding me once again of the great journal, the Afrocentric World Review, and of course, Black World Negro Digest. I mean, I shudder to think what would happen in Chicago. Y'all had decided to migrate to Chicago. We would be so much further behind. The lectures that he's done, UNI Corpus, as Conrad said, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the African Communities Legal World just celebrated the century in existence. The Association of African Educators, African American Educators, Dr. Pates has written some brilliant work on that, and I can't wait because, you know, I started calling the Secretary of Education. I saw Arnie Duncan in the airport name for the man with 3 6s in all 3 of his names. He was getting off the plane as I was getting on. I was saying, man, I don't want to get on no plane. You just got off. I guess he was coming from here, so thanks for sending him back to D.C. But at any rate, the Association of Afro-American Educators, this is a joke, I know y'all ain't nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that. But that corpus of lectures, the Association of African Historians, of course, ASCAC, and then any number, we could have filled up all these categories with so much more. His genealogy, that Thompson comes out of networks of African autonomies and conditional sovereignties. That's 47th Street, looking east across South Parkway, right? He said that's the epicenter of Black Chicago. He was born not too far from there. What did he say? He was born in Cook County Hospital. Most Negroes came into the world from there. Neighborhood, right? But it's people from not too far from Holly Springs. He said one of the bloodlines out me from Holly Springs, Mississippi. Ida B. Wells. I don't know Mississippi, bro. I love the state of Mississippi. I love it. When Chokeway died, I think we all cried like a baby. But the work continues. But out of Mississippi, that means something, right? What was it like to be hocking the Defender at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning that day? Y'all out there, paper boys, huh? Cold, right? I wore a spring coat. It's a winter coat in Maryland, but I wore my coat and y'all came out here and tricked me. But they assured me tomorrow we'll be back in Chicago or one day soon, so. Dr. Thompson always talking about this being a spectator as other people had their parade. The captain European nations, so you go back to the Cold War and know that this was a big deal in the 50s, right? The Cold War. And after World War II, Russia, free nations, don't let the UN convicted Soviet aggressors who have enslaved our countries pose as champions of national freedom. And Dr. Thompson say, we see everybody, the Albanians, the Czechs, the Estonians waving their flag, and the American Negroes on the curb watching. Where's our flag? Of course, the UNA gave us a flag. We waved that flag, and it makes me laugh because Howard's colors are red, white, and blue. And one day this week, I guess it's Friday night, I don't know who did it, and if I did, I couldn't say. But they ran the red, black, and green flag on the flagpole at Howard. They do that all the time. I mean, that disruption of the network, I just love it. But he said, we have to be careful about this. This is at the beginning of chapter 4 of his dissertation. He heard this as a little boy and then put it in his doctoral dissertation. He says he was told this by the wise elders of Washington Park in 1948. He said, he knows that white man and shows we studying here. Boy, let me tell you something. The boy is Dr. Thompson. And don't you ever forget it as long as you live to teach to your own children when you get some. Boy, now you listen here. This white man stole all the knowledge he's been using from the black man, from our people, and got it locked up over in them schools of his. Yes, sir. Everything he know came from the black man. Now, I didn't get too far in school, son, but I know that much now. Since you're a schoolboy, you just walk up to him and say, white man, give me back my knowledge you stole from my people, and do it. We got to do it. Now, August Wilson, the brilliant playwright, there's only a man. I love August Wilson, man. August Wilson got an honorary degree from Howard University the same year we gave Venus Williams one. And Venus got hers, and she thanked everybody. She said, I wish me and my sister could have gone to school. We were kind of busy at work, but if we could have, we would have come here, So you see this anymore. But then August Wilson got up. He was sick with the cancer. He was going to take his life not too long after that. Send him to the ancestral realm. And he said, I stand here in my grandfather's shoes. He said, I stand here in the shoes of men and women who came to the north from the south with nothing but dust and fresh hope, marked men carrying Bibles and guitars. I want to thank you because as I stand here, you see this out. And you could have heard a pin drop. But of course, I knew from reading the director's notes that those were the opening director's notes from Joe Turner's company. And the lyricism of, which is one of these probably all the plays got Africa in them, but that's probably one of the most African plays, that Gem in the Ocean, where he just kind of opens up the whole crossroads. But to these words that Dr. Thompson included years later in his doctoral dissertation, when he heard as a little boy, there's nothing nothing that August Wilson wrote that's any more powerful than those instructions. And he has carried those instructions out over the arc of his life. What are some of the other select moments in his coming of age as scholar and educator? Teaching and building community in various institutionalized learning spaces. Substituting teaching, administration, and entering the programmatic wars. Taught elementary school, as Brother Conrad told you. Worked at DeSaules, where he went to high school, and I guess one of Roberta's was one of his teachers, art teacher. You see this dedication, entering the programmatic wars. And again, we'll have to wait for Dr. Pace's book to lead us through those struggles. What they call it, the triple T. He used to give out grants to people, right? And the Barbara Sizemore and Thompson got involved in some programmatic work, and he begins to understand how money begins to change things. Lauren Hill said, funny how money changes situations. Coming out, you saw how that. But he said that Dr. Thompson, the tide of black revolution was moving, and we surfed it, creating a black communiverse. That's really what we're talking about. Teachers College South, Teachers College North, and I guess Teachers College North became what? Northeastern Illinois. And he said, I was at DeSaules, substitute teaching, and not Don Davis, but my man is Don Smith. Thank you, Barbara. That's what I'm talking about. This graph, you can't really go wrong. Somebody in here knew all that because they were there. Don Smith was substitute teaching. They got together in summer program. Next thing you know, Don Smith had been brought up to Teachers College North to do some stuff, and then he wrote a little grant, whatever. And now here we are, all these years later, at the Center for Inner City Studies. This ain't supposed to exist. That's why you have to defend it with your life.
That's right.
That's why we have to defend it with our lives. But it started with teachers. These guys are teaching. These women and men are teaching elementary school, high school, substitute teachers, going to school at night, going to school, teaching on the weekends, and they create this communiverse. The Black University, this is part 3 of what it was taken over 3 years, the Black University. Of course, you see that Atlanta, Chicago, Malcolm X Liberation University, but the communiversity was the chapter in this issue of Negro Digest that talked about this question of what would develop in this space. And of course, the Association of Afro-American Educators, as I said, that's Larry Crow picture. That same cool smile. Select moments continue. National and international mission. The Center for Study Years. You have the Journal of Inner City Studies that came out here, then the Afrocentric World Review. There are some of the issues there. Black Books Bulletin, of course. There's a picture of the one Conrad held up, which has the Tour of African Historiography piece. The 6th Pan African Congress is just one of the many meetings. I think this is the, it's my right math, right? This is the 40th anniversary of the 6th Pan African Congress.
That's right.
Isn't that really? And that 6th Pan African Congress was very important because what you see, of course, we had a Kemetic Institute, of course, that emerged absolutely in this space. The 6th Pan African Congress is interesting because listening to some folks talking today before I left D.C. about that 6-pack, some of the young people who were in Washington, who come out of SNCC, who then came to D.C., who went to Tanzania in '74, and then came back and formed the D.C. Corps for what the folks in Chicago had done, because a lot of ANC and PAC and NCAPA, everybody who was involved in some form of South African liberation struggle came through this space, really ignited the Free South Africa movement. So people say, well, what do these meetings do? What do these scholars do? What do these thinkers do? Well, they go back and organize because local movement is fueled by the vision of an international unity. That's really at the core of Dr. Thompson's work, of course, the Kemetic Institute. So the Thompson philosophy of history. Let's look at that treatise on African historiography. That's the front page of his doctoral dissertation. Treatise on African historiography, submitted by Anson Thompson, a partial fulfillment for requirement of a degree of Doctor of Philosophy, Union Graduate School, Mill Springs, Ohio, June 1977. Key observation 1 of 3. Number 1, that black theoreticians, historians, etc., join hands in the making of an African interpretation of history that will assist us in the formation of an international theory that will be capable of winning black mass support in the world. That's tough. You can come up with a theory, but how you gonna get people to come along with you? Elijah Muhammad did a pretty good job. He came up with a theory and then he kept it simple. White man's the devil, he's the graphic devil. He's made up on the island of Patmos. Mr. Yaakov, the biggest sign. I want you, man. and people say, well, how could you believe that? Okay. Same way you believe this. Take, this is my body. See, once you get a theory, you have to figure a way to translate once said about another Chicagoan for a time, Jack Johnson, genius is the ability to make the difficult thing look simple. It looked real easy till I tried it. That's what Dr. Thompson is saying. The black theoreticians have to get involved. That's what the historiography comes in. So you get a guy like Martin Delaney, right? Delaney is traveling absolutely. And of course he runs the genealogy. Delaney is one of those major figures, certainly here in Chicago, because of this institution. Delaney has gone all over the country. I was talking about Delaney last week to my students because I had gone to Coppin State for a day and come back and I was showing the students some of the folks who were involved in the Institute for Colored Youth that was run for a time by Fannie Jackson Coppin, who Coppin State, Baltimore is named for. But the Institute for Colored Youth moved out of Philly and became Cheney University. One of the men on the faculty of the Institute for Colored Youth in the mid-19th century was a dude named Robert Campbell, of course, a Jamaican who, along with Delaney, traveled to Nigeria in the 1850s. But then, near the end of his life, his physical life, Delaney writes The Origin of Races and Colors, where he's trying to learn some meta-lecture and see, can I elevate this theoretically and move our people forward? He's a political thinker, but he understands you've got to have an intellectual foundation. That's where a lot of our political thinkers get lost. The struggle here in Chicago, there's a couple of brand new books on this very fascinating. The whole struggle with Chicago Teachers Union. It's very important to understand. Understand that this is about the education of our children, but the education of our children in this community means the education not only of our children and of our nation, but creating a vision for the future. There's no vision here. There's no vision without education. That's why that struggle is so important. The people who are trying to suppress education have a vision. The mayor of this city has a real vision. I can't make all y'all go back south, but I'm damn sure going to try. And the whole thing, and my thing is, bring it on. You are a weak, illiterate man.
Yes.
You come from a culture that cannot possibly withstand even the simplest push from us if we would but just push.
That's right.
Yes.
And it is the fear of that, what Du Bois called the great fear. He said, what is the great lack? The great lack of the Negro is energy. This is a little touchy when he said this. He said this in 1908 at Hampton. 1906 at Hampton. He said, I was going to Hampton, these little conferences in the summertime, and they never asked me to say anything. I said, I ain't going back to more conferences until they asked me to speak, and then when they asked me, I'm going to say what I want, and I'm leaving. So they asked him in 1906, and at Hampton University, the home of Booker T. Washington, where Booker T. Washington went to school, he gave an address called the Hampton Idea. He said, the great lack that the Negro has is energy. He says, because no hurried, worried race could have built what we built in Africa. But these people we dealing with are hurried, worried race. This is, as Dr. President, this is some very, and Charles Grantham always, this is some very un-African weather. This is not the weather that Negroes like. Summertime, we'll get our barbecue, we're going to do it, and now it's cold. But some people who migrated, some of us who migrated and adapted to this, we like this. We'll build a skyscraper 1 million stories tall, and why would you go through all that? Okay, the fact that you asked that question shows the great lack. Then he said, what's the great need? Organization. But then he says, what is the great fear? The great fear is that they realize that once you take your energy and repurpose it, it's over. That's the great fear. That's why they got all the police in Missouri right now. The great fear, is this the time? Is this the time? Is this the time? I don't know. Is it the time? We all gonna find out together. What Dr. Thompson is saying is that we can't take this thing for chance. An explosion doesn't advance us as much as a theoretical project that we bought into that will allow us to advance. So the key objective number 2 of 3 is that the creation of this black international theory will serve as a useful instrument for serious study of black mass organizations. These italics are his emphasis. In America, Africa, the Caribbean, etc. The character and leadership of these organizations, which includes the study of worldwide black leaders in relationship to their use of short-sighted strategies and tactics, must be seriously explored. There, like Du Bois, what Thompson is doing is saying we have to look at our mistakes. That's hard. Because when you're trying to fill gaps, you don't want to think about the mistakes. Because they feel like losses instead of opportunities to take advantage of what we now know not to do. And because when there's a gap, you want to fill that gap, you don't want to feel bad. Think about how we think about our history. As Dr. Carr used to always say, in some stories, it ain't no good guys. Well, Well, Shaka built the Zulu nation. Shaka was cold-blooded. I don't know how many people in this room, myself included, would have liked Shaka. Or Toussaint, who has some Francophile tendencies, or even Dessalines for that matter. But when you got a gap, you romanticize it. And the Thompson is like, we have to have a black international theory that is self-critical. We've got to look at how short-sighted strategies and tactics must be seriously explored. We have to look at this. And finally, oh yeah, I'm sorry. This is an interesting book, came out maybe 8-9 years ago. Mary Desiak's book, Cold War Civil Rights, where she makes the argument that we've known for many years, which is, the reason that the civil rights movement in this country got any traction at all was because this country had the great fear that the Negro was going to go international. Which is why they took Paul Roleson's passport, Islamic Good Roleson's passport, W.E. Du Bois, Shirley Grant Du Bois took their passports, William Patterson tried to run another, all the people with Chicago ties, particularly William Patterson. Then, took their passports. You got to shut this international thing down. But of course, what did we see last week? Mike Brown's mother and father were in Geneva at the UN, right? And so we saw before that George Davis's father and Trayvon Martin's mother and father were at the UN the week Mike Brown got shot. And it was George Davis' father that said, I'm going to raise the name of this young brother that just got killed in Missouri, Mike Brown. They're in Geneva. This country is shaking. You Negroes supposed to stay here. Here's the deal. You stay here, you can eat a hamburger in the restaurant. But that was the deal they made with the 3 Negroes who had that as an objective, not the rest of us. That's right. And what Desiak is saying is that Cold War maneuver bought this country some time. But that time has run out. And what Dr. Thompson is saying is that the creation of the black international theory helps us understand the local struggles in an international context, which means we don't get caught up in little fights. Finally, we need a complete study of non-African impact in the total African world to include European uses of the Negro or nigger question, he just calls it what it is. And how Europeans use history as an ideological weapon of warfare against Africans. The reason I have this in quotation marks is because this is in his dissertation. I'm saying, who was on your committee? In fact, I asked him that one time, who was on your committee? Aryanism as a way of life and a social science phenomenon. There's Gunnar Murdoch, the American dilemma. And it goes deep in this city too. It's my man, St. Clair Dre, Horace King, Black Metropolis. Gunnar Murdoch got off that plane from Sweden and found as many smart Negroes as he could to do his work for him. Then he put a gloss over it. Ralph Bunche, Du Bois, the Outward Memos, Charles Thompson, Stuart Brown, Lane Locke. So, the chapters in the dissertation, historiography, the Aryan Way, survey of 19th century Aryan social science and its influence on anti-African historiography, conquest and subsequent comparative study, and the social science missionaries. What does that mean? Wait a minute. I think I went too far. There we go. I got too cute by half. The origin of species, Darwin. He says Darwin, the origin of species, right? Everybody adapts and moves forward, and that basically, then they took that and made social Darwins. That's why white was so great. Jerry Dunn is basically saying the same thing in the book that he just published a couple years ago, not even 2 years ago, The World Until Yesterday, where we can learn from traditional societies. In other words, how do we get so great? Social science missionaries like Niall Ferguson, the Brit who's at Harvard now, who did the series Civilization, The West and the Rest. That's the book, the PBS did the series. Du Bois tried to deal with it in 1945 in his book, The World in Africa. We need a different theoretical response, which is why the last chapter, or the next last chapter in Thompson's dissertation, is the black intellectual resistance to Aryan historiography. He says, historiography is the mother science of European ideological warfare on the rest of the world, and history is the fact-loaded, systematically contrived ideological weaponry of Western civilization. That's on page 14. Let me pause there for a second before I go forward. A handful more slides, but I've been talking for 53 minutes and 19 seconds, and I need to do a time check because I'm like sitting here all night. About 15 minutes, is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, Dr. Faith, as I tell my friend Russell Adams, who still teaches the class at Howard, who I don't agree with on a whole lot, but I do agree with, well, I don't have to agree with this with him because he didn't have anything to do with this. This is his parents' fault. The guy who was here, right? Great Negroes past and present. The guy who wrote Great Negroes past and present is still working at Howard University. He retired about 7-8 years ago, but I told him as long as you want to come to work and meet the mule brother, you can have a class in this department. Plus his wife don't like you sitting in the house all day. I've been getting on her nerves, so he just get up and go to work. I softwoods available. More recently, they started making the girls out of plastic. So I know that, man, you can sit here for another 3 days, but I want to make sure that those of us who may have some less superior materials in our makeup, you know, we might have had that kind of stamina here. We had to build up the steel. Because I know, man, I would love, and when we finish this, I promise you, I want to get some more conversation. The strategy of Western history as such is to focus all eyes on the important dates of the late arrival of on the scene Aryans, who attempted to make sense of the ancient African civilization they had desecrated. That's very interesting because what Dr. Thompson does in his work on historiography, not just in the dissertation, but in his broad work, what he says is these Europeans, who he's calling Aryans, of course, what they did was they came late and then said everything started when we came, and then created a way of memory that makes everybody have to remember their experience through that small framework. Right. It seems like a very simple thing, but it's been devastatingly effective. Because we all look at the world that way. I mean, one quick example that isn't obvious until it is obvious, we're having this conversation in English. This is the garbage can language of the Europeans. It's a car crash between the Germanic languages and the Romance languages. It doesn't even make good sense to the Europeans. They learn Latin and Greek. English, oh man, those are them tribes who was up there in the woods and couldn't quite get rid of, and then, you know, who beat back the French after they invented the so-called English Isles for a number of years. My point is this: that is an example of the short-term memory we use to even talk about liberation. That's why this institution is so important. The study of meta-nature, the study of African languages, frees us up and allows us to make those connections. So he goes on to say, whenever we use the word history, we are automatically speaking of Western civilization. That's the new movie coming. Yeah. Right? Well, by today, they gave a little statue, the memory of things. Jamie Foxx in another coon role. I don't care if everybody in the movie black. Annie is white. This is symbolic of what I keep saying that because they were so tight. This is what Dr. Thompson is saying. Once you set the frame, you put whatever colors you want. You can't make that movie a black, you can't make that a black story. You can even make a hip hop version. It's a hard knock life. You take that Rockefeller, another example, and take all that garbage away, because our children look at that stuff and think you got a road to liberation. You're trying to fill a gap. Your whole life is about a gap. Because if you weren't trying to fill a gap, you wouldn't have that stupid poster, and you wouldn't be standing there looking stupid about to have some more people fall off the cliff. Major themes: there's an African world crisis. Gerald Horne's book, Blows Against the Empire. The whole empire is in crisis. And what is needed is theory and practice to defend the interests of African populations and resources. This is what he would call the African principle. My brother Kamal has done a lot of work on this. He did a presentation at ASCAC recently on Anderson Thompson and on this idea of the political implications of his theoretical work. And he's been developing that work for quite some time. So it's very exciting to know that we're on the verge of re-engaging Dr. Thompson's work and continuing. So we need these intellectual frameworks. This is a recent book that came out by Samuel Moyn and Sartori, Global Intellectual History, Columbia University Press. I bought the book, even though I looked in there at a chapter on African historiography, African intellectual history, that was deeply inferior, but that was the point. Indian intellectual history, Chinese intellectual history, Japanese intellectual history, African intellectual history was like so thin.
I have to shine down.
This is 2014, and we're still failing to grasp. And this is Columbia University, which is ostensibly supposed to be one of the good universities, right, in this country. The King's College, before the Americans took it. And I'm saying, y'all let this past y'all editors? Yes. Why? Because just like the man told John Henry Clark when he was a little boy in Union Springs, Alabama, or Columbia, Georgia by that time, just like they tried to tell Arturo Schauber, y'all ain't got no history. You have no history. Now go in there and watch Scandal and be quiet. The many moments in Thompson's work, and here's the problem with Scandal. I'm going to say that to you know. I ain't going to talk about Scandal today. I have enough fun making the students go crazy talking about Scandal. You're going to take the deep cultural contributions of African memory and culture keepers and make it the soundtrack for the most anti-African behavior on network television today. That is the definition of schizophrenia. Thematic moments in Thompson's work. Last night, I'm not saying Stevie Wonder must be getting paid a ton of money. How y'all saw last night when she was dancing around, taking off her clothes, what you gonna have sex with the white dude, and underneath was, "Don't you worry about a thing." I'm like, wow. So to clear the copyrights for that music, do you know how much money ABC is investing in this pathology that comes on Thursday nights? Because it ain't B-sides that they play on Scandal. It is the A-list stuff. It's the Marvin Gaye. It's the Supremes. It's war. And the more pathological the moment, the deeper it's like the inverse. It's like the inverse of what Curtis Mayfield did in Superfly. Chicago. Mayfield narrated that whole narrative as these people are sick. It opens with, "When it's dead, that's what I said." Man, he's telling you! We can deal with rockets and dreams, but reality, what does it mean? Don't be misled. Just look afraid. But this is a Sagansky movie. What did he do? I'm telling y'all, what y'all watching on the screen, I don't want you to leave here. Now, to this day, 2014, many years later, Curtis Mayfield's an ancestor, and what do we know about Superfly? We know the soundtrack, meaning what? Mission accomplished. I put my memory in your eyes. Y'all can watch that images all you want. Thematic moments in Thompson's work. Time, the construction of historical philosophy and historiography, a battle for time and space, setting that research agenda, network, the recovery of intellectual genealogy, organizing and connecting living organizations, the central function of travel as a form of transient autonomy and conditional sovereignty. We'll come back in a second. Finally, narration, narrating history, education as rehearsal for autonomy and sovereignty, and dealing with an African World History Project. Well, time, setting a research agenda. There he is in 1987. Yeah, that's one. Kim, right? He didn't talk but about 10 minutes. But I promise you, very interesting. He said, we gotta have a 20-year research agenda in 2, 4, or 5-year increments. Now this is a twice total table to many people in this room. But let's be very clear. We are off schedule now with the World History Project. We gotta get back on schedule. But it's interesting because his dissertation in 1977 is 12 years after the developing an African historiography. 10 years later, you see him revisit a lot of this in his work. And then 10 years after that, you see him as the chair of the historiography subcommittee for Aztec's Research Commission, of which he was the chair, the preliminary challenge. The meetings which took place right here in this building. You see him trying to keep on track. 10 years from when he gave this talk, this body was in our hands. So you see that working. Objectives, national, regional research commissions. We need a research section driven from the bottom up, meaning what? Everybody in here has memories, and that's why when I sit down in a couple of minutes, I hope one of the things we take away from here is the importance of collecting our national memories. This is something that Corellas used to say all the time. Many people in this room, collecting our family memories. What is at stake here? Our worldview and a planned effort to, quote, bring about the general renewal and cultural foundations of the African world community. Let me quote off the end there, end quote. In fact, we are the people that started time. That's what he said right here. He's not talking about natural time. He's talking about that relational time, the concept of time. Once you control time and space, you can change everything else. The civil rights movement, no. That was the Africanization of the American experiment. Huh? Yeah, you said civil rights. Huh? What does that mean? Civil as in civic, as in civitas? Well, democracy. Democracy as in the Democratic tradition. You mean Athenian democracy? You mean that little city-state that couldn't even get with Sparta? Have you seen 300? Y'all ain't had a democracy. But we use the language, and so when we use the language, we absorb their time and space. He's saying you have to think differently. That's a bold statement. He goes on, says questions of continuity over long arcs of time are what are at stake. In fact, he says, whenever we talk about history, we're really talking about the future. That's why he said that again. So time, constructing historical philosophy and historiography. He says in that same talk, I'll use historiography until we can find a better term. The way history is written, by whom and for what reasons. In a talk he gave in 2007 in Philadelphia, The Decade of Truth, African Intellectual Warfare Against Thematic Historiography. He gave it at Aztec Conference. In fact, that was the year we were at Ben Franklin High School. That was the same year Baba Asa made his transition. We went to Kemet later later that summer. He talks about his famous categories: captive historiography, bedroom historiography, and some of the responses: Sambo historiography. You see a lot of Sambo historiography. Entertainment historiography. That's Henry Louis Gates' bailiwick. He's somewhere like a Sambo entertainer. And the redemptionist historiography, the attempts to punch holes in it. World communities and narratives are written from the perspective of different groups. African, the role of Kush, for example, he's dealing with that. Asian, sometimes he includes Arab, says Arab Asian, sometimes he keeps Arab separate. And then the area of European. No, the responses from the other worldview centers to an African historiography will be virulent. You're not allowed to tell your own story. You cannot claim these people. And so it's very difficult. You can't have Fannie Lou Hamer standing next to Malcolm X in Detroit. That doesn't fit. Fannie Lou Hamer wanted the right to vote. Malcolm X was an apostle of violence. No. Go listen to what they said. No. They're Africans. No. You can't have Fannie Lou Hamer in West Africa getting her hair braided and Sacred Teray sweeping her up in his arms. You can't have that. It doesn't fit. She's got to stay in Louisville, Mississippi. She got to be on Capitol Hill saying, "I question America." Yeah, she did all that. But you can't separate her. It's very important to understand that's why those responses will be virulent. They don't want us to do that. Not just learning mathematics, he says in this talk. He says the great battle is in, quote, reestablishing a way of looking at the world, and from that point of view, we have some notion of what the future should be. Network, how do you recover intellectual genealogy? That's a picture I took this summer when we were at Mama Sybil's house in New York. Of course, Dr. Carr, there you see, cats standing there, everybody smiling. They are sitting there. Defenders of the African way and black scrappers are old scrappers. Thompson coinage. At least he writes it down. But like everything else around here, none of y'all will take credit for anything, which is fine with me because we do create things collectively. Stories of their lives, movements, organizations, events, persons who struggle. Thompson frames what we might call intellectual history now. That's how you frame it. He says they would take that one volume or one sheet of paper and cast it against thousands of volumes in white scholarship. And we're giving a dedication to these brothers and sisters who battle against 1,000 lies, insults, and injuries against Mother Africa and her children. That's important because when you write the history of the world down on little slips of paper, people might miss the fact that any one of them little slips can destroy the thing you're writing against. And they may take, and you know, some people weigh scholarship by weight. Oh, that's a good book. W.B. Du Bois is 25 years old. He sat down and wrote something called the Credo. You see, that's what I believe. That little thing is on one sheet of paper, and it's one of the most powerful things you ever see written. You don't have to write a whole lot. If everybody do a little, nobody has to do a lot. But if you just do a little, he talks about that. This is how you create a network. Early black guerrilla fighters, he talks about, who are we? The scholar's army, armed with a systematic approach. The people in this room, this is the charge that Dr. Thompson gave us, and then brothers and Dr. Carruthers and Zinger Heru, and to everybody else in this room that said, this is your charge. Go find some more people. So for 20 years, that's what I've been doing. Trying to find some more people. Always more people. The high school students in Philly, all the students at Howard. You send a student at Howard, they're going to get Anderson Thompson and Jacob Carruthers and everybody in this room. That's my job. And then get out of your way. You say, go get some more people, right? Because we need an army. The intellectual mothers and fathers of the African world who struggled so long ago to make us into what we are today. And then, of course, the genealogy. He talks about the genealogy. We all know many of the names in the genealogy, so I won't read them in the interest of time. I'm about to wind up. The network, organizing and connecting living organizations like the UNIA. Pan-African Congresses, like Six-Pack, the Congress of Intellectuals of the African Diaspora, it was in Dakar, the National Black United Front, ASCAP, you know, in both. That we're well here. What is network? Central function of travel. Wait, Carr, about 5 minutes. Okay, that's good. Wrap it up. That's what I said. See, I didn't even know he was coming. But George will say the energy, no question, I already knew that. The central function of travel is a form of transient autonomy and conditional sovereignty. What does that mean? Travel becomes a form of transient autonomy. When you're traveling, you're in charge of yourself and what you're doing, within limits. And conditional sovereignty. That's why travel is so important. That's why going to Brazil for the Festival of Morte was so important. That's why going to Sudan is so important. That's why going to the Pan-African meetings, including the Conference of Africans and Intellectuals in the Diaspora. It is Minoko Rashidi, who was so flattered to be, given all this time to talk about African history by Abdoulaye Wade, who was on his way out, as the Senegalese said, get the hell out of our presidency. But it's complicated. But the point is that when we're moving, we're capturing the sense that we are in control. That's why Dr. Thompson taking people places creates a sense that for this moment, in this movement, we are in charge. This is what sovereignty feels like. This is what community feels like. So when I go back where I'm from, I have some nufuki, I have some connection. So when I go on my job, somebody says, you're going to be like, okay. Not today, but one day soon. Because I know what it feels like for you not to be in charge. I've been somewhere where it don't even look like that. So this is a temporary condition. I'm now feeling a gap in my vision with what comes after. That's a very deliberate practice. That's one of the gifts Dr. Thompson has. Network. Wait, went the wrong way. Sorry. Yeah. Narration, African World History Project. He says a tree of African history has to be built as part of a classical reconstruction, a very vivid, perceptual, visual tree of African world history. We have to re-periodize. That's why I put that picture up. This is a new book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Gerald and I were talking about when I was in Houston the other day. She said, what would a history of the United States look like if it were written by the people who were here when they came? She said, this ain't the end of it, but this is my attempt. And when y'all read this book, you read this book, you start reading, you want me to put it down. In other words, I'm not going to talk about this in terms of this is when Mississippi came into existence. Here's where Tennessee came from. Here's when they moved into the Ohio Valley. No! I'm like, we can do none of our business and then these people came. And today, we are still waiting for them to leave. What does immigration look like when you write history like, these are the people who came to my land, put up a fence, and then said, I'm supposed to ask them for permission to move. That's what the immigration debate is. But that means you have to change the frame, change your time and space. Finally, reassess the state of the world from an African perspective. Thompson, the European world dominance peaked with the beginning of World War I and after World War II. A long decline and a rising anti-Aryan resistance began that continues. That right there, what does that mean? You read Nicholas Baker's book, Human Smoke, he kind of says that too. World War I, Thompson says, is the peak of Europe's power. Now here we are in 2014, what are we going to do? No. They peaked in World War I. It's been a decline since then, slow and steady. Think about that. Mandela was born 1918? Was it 18? It was 18. That's the year World War I ended. He lived to be the president of the country that they had just consolidated 16 years before, the Union of South Africa. World War I marks the beginning of the end. If we look at it that way, that gives us hope. Now you feel the gap back that you didn't know you had. All right, I should stop. Because it's narrative. We talk about narrative and curriculum. I'll put this up so you can get it on film. Y'all can get the DVD. The narrative tropes in the African World History Project, the themes in his philosophy of history is future-oriented, intellectual warfare, rhythms of invasion and expulsion. He's always talking about people invading and getting put out. Understand, just because they invaded, they will get put out. In fact, he says we are heading to the 21st century, but it might not be the 21st century forward. It may be back to the 21st century like the Hyksos invasion, which means what? It comes with an expulsion. Think about that as they gentrify this neighborhood. They'll leave again, we'll put them out. Black international theory, reconstructing African world identity. Let me end with this slide, all right? Because this one, I want to end with this one. I had a couple more, but if I can end with this one, I'll be satisfied. I'll be satisfied because this is important. The archive as eternal. The library as process. This is the last slide. John Clark. This is a still shot from A Great and Mighty Walk. Many of you know, many of you participated. Only in this room, in this world, could I say that. If you've seen A Great and Mighty Walk, you know that Clark gave a great account of his life. You also know, and Brother Kamal said that, he said this hashtag, brother, that, something should be done with Dr. Thompson like this, and I agree. You have to write those questions, because what Dr. Thompson did was write the questions. He got in there, put them around Larry Crow, Conrad, they all looked around, okay, ask this, ask that, and what you see Dr. Clark doing on film is answering the questions that people knew to ask him, and those people came out of this space right here. So he's downloading his mental computer. Those books, of course, come from his library. So why is that important? The Thompson archive exists as an extension of its author. People think about stuff like it's just stuff. Stuff was a symbol. And I would never do it on the pain of being sent to early ancestors, but that's kind of World's bad. He assembled that. Those pieces of paper he's writing on, he's assembling that. That's got to end up somewhere. But if you take him out of the equation, you have to keep that stuff in the same place. Because together it narrates the story. And this is what Thompson says about archive in 1987. He says an archive is, quote, a place where you store anything and everything pertaining to what you're about. It's not like a library. It's not materials that are sent out or let out. It is that which you store that represents and reflects what you're about. Libraries, as he goes on to say, publish, print, and reprint. It's important to do that. But an archive is assembled piece by its architect, its author. An archive is like a book on its own. People understand that. This is a family right here. These guys here, the Warburg brothers, the one on the end, they're all a banker family. They were German, banker's family. The guy on the end wanted control over the whole bank that his daddy had left. So the next brother says, you can buy me out in exchange for all the books I ever want to buy. He said, okay. That became the collection that's in the University of London. They kept it exactly like he put it together. That's what's important. Got this book, The Temporary Nature of African Libraries has become a truism, an extension of the apocryphal disassembly of the Library of Alexandria. Every time somebody moves away or somehow, we lose an archive. We lose an archive. At least let's preserve the stuff. If possible, keep it in the same place. That means we're going to invest in some places to put it. Questions of intellectual sovereignty and inviolate space mean archives and libraries reorient our sense of time, space, and the possible. This city has great libraries. Think about the libraries in this city that are libraries that were assembled by people, and they've kept those libraries exactly as they are, they just add to them. And when you go in that space, you go into a different mindset, which is why we have to ask the question, what is the relationship of words to reality, time, network, and narration? Finally, this book. I got this book about 2 years ago in South Africa, at Swanee, which the South Africans have renamed Pretoria. And it's called Becoming Worthy Ancestors, Archives, Public Deliberation, and Identity in South Africa. These authors are talking about why it's important to put all your memories in one place. And then to create a place where your children can come and just sit in those memories and piece by piece begin not only to engage them, but with your help, by you being in the place, asking questions. Why do you have this and this? I see this sock, I see this magazine, and I see this little piece of yellow paper. And it just looks like 3 different, okay, let me tell you what happened. This sock I had on the night we wore. This little yellow piece of paper was what I had to give as an IOU to the man who drove the cab, who said, you don't have no money, well, you got to have a child. I mean, in other words, but if they're not there, it's just stuff. Together, that becomes how you fortify what you will do with your life. We have to be careful with our stuff now. And I know that Dr. Thompson, if he were here, would just be shaking his head and adding to another pile of his stuff. Thank you all.